While the topic of making your writing flow is not necessarily specific to graduate level writing or English as second language learning in terms of writing or science writing, academic writing, it is important for everyone who is writing. And when we are talking about really complex ideas and results of studies, as you are in your theses, making your writing flow and engaging for the reader is really important. So this is a module that is important for anyone who writes, and maybe particularly especially for all of you. So there's 4 different levels of flow that you can achieve in your writing. One is within a sentence, so how words flow from the beginning to the end. One is between sentences, intersentence flow, so this is from one sentence to the next. Another is paragraph flow, so this is one paragraph to the next paragraph. And finally, section flow, so how your chapters or sections flow together. We'll talk about all of these briefly, but we're going to focus on flow between sentences and between paragraphs, which tend to represent the most challenges and are perhaps most important for achieving smooth writing. So within a sentence, you generally make writing flow from word to word by joining clauses together. And you can kind of try to remember that there are a number of different transition words out there to use. There's simple transition words, there's more complex ways of bridging gaps between sentences. There's also punctuation solutions, as we discussed in an earlier module, so you could use a semicolon to make a sentence flow, or em dashes or commas. But in terms of transition words, the most simple words can be remembered with this acrostic, fanboys. For, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. And I think everyone watching this presentation is probably familiar with these words, and they are all distinct and simple and useful for your writing. So is perhaps the most colloquial or informal word, which can be replaced in academic writing with more advanced words. But just remember that when you do have a comma between 2 independent clauses, you do need a word like this. It can be as simple as and to join those clauses so that you don't commit a comma splice. So just a quick example of using a transition word to make a sentence flow. Additional data is critical to understanding water usage, but this data is difficult to acquire. Quite simple. More complex words to make sentences flow from one clause to the next, or just with even a single complex clause, are conjunctive adverbs. So this is a list of some of those that you might use. However, thus, hence, therefore, nonetheless, although, regardless. A lot of these are synonyms. But it's important to try to vary the conjunctive adverbs or transition words that you're using so that you're not using, for example, the word furthermore over and over and over again as your go-to transition word. It's going to get old. So this is especially something to look for in the revision process. Did you use the word however every other sentence to start a new sentence or join 2 clauses? Then perhaps it's time to switch it up a little bit because diversity is really important to good writing so that your readers don't tune out and become bored. And also, you want the most specific, best word for the job, as we talked about in vocabulary. So an example of how to use one of these conjunctive adverbs, we recommend further tests regardless of the fact that our outcomes were as expected. Another way to make a sentence flow within itself is the concept of parallelism. So this is making different clauses align in the way that you're using verbs, for example. So the most common place that this is important and appears in writing is within lists. So the idea is that when you have a complex list, so it's not just filled with nouns like I bought apples, grapes, and bananas at the grocery store, when you're talking about more complex items within the list that utilize verbs and perhaps additional words, you want to make them all set up in the same fashion. You want to make them parallel with each other. So an example of this occurring successfully is great scientists know how to design effective studies, gather data efficiently, and analyze findings with a critical eye. So our 3 verbs that set off each of the 3 items on the list are all present tense singular verbs, and therefore they align. So it's pleasing to the reader. It's not confusing and jarring. Why is one of these in the past tense, for example, or in the infinitive? Because we have the 2 set up at the beginning. So, for example, we would violate parallelism if we said, great scientists know how to design effective studies, to gather data efficiently, and analyze findings with a critical eye. Then we would have 2 for 2 items on the list, and one without. Or if we said great scientists know how to design effective studies, gathered data efficiently, and analyze findings with a critical eye, not only have we violated agreement in terms of tense, but it makes for a non-parallel sloppy list that is going to confuse the reader. So in general, you can just remember that parallelism is how we align clauses and align subjects. And this principle can be applied more broadly. You might use parallelism in the way that you, for example, start each section or conclude each section, or use topic sentences. You can create trends within your own writing that are a little bit poetic and creative, and that are also pleasing to the reader. Here are just a couple examples of two sentences that violate parallelism. So the first would be, in Pakistan, industrial waste, sewage, and dumping used oils are the leading causes of freshwater pollution. And the next, the product is vital to improve the health of the community and for restoring the environment. So take a second, pause, and try to rewrite these sentences correctly using parallelism. Think about what is in violation here. So there are, of course, always multiple ways to correct an incorrect sentence, but this is one way to restore parallelism in these sentences. The first, in Pakistan, industrial waste, sewage, and used oil contamination are the leading causes of freshwater pollution. So the problem with this originally was that our first two items in the list were nouns or compound nouns, industrial waste and sewage, and the next one used a verb set up with a noun or a compound noun, so dumping instead of just a noun as the first beginning item or beginning part of that third item. So we corrected that by putting contamination after used oil to turn it into a compound noun like the others. And the second one, this product is vital to improve the health of the community and restore the environment. So the problem with this one is that this wasn't really a grammatical mistake again, but it did not satisfy the idea of parallel alignment between the two items in our list. So the first is to improve the environment, and then the second one was restoring versus restore. And so if we can set them both up to be corresponding to to in the infinitive, then we've made a more parallel and satisfactory list. Another grammatical violation of flow, so this isn't just poor writing, it's actually incorrect writing, is the dangling modifier. This is kind of a silly term, maybe overly technical, but basically what it means is when you have an introductory clause that is supposed to describe a certain subject and instead accidentally describes a different subject than intended. So an example would be, in examining the samples, comma, the water was found to be contaminated with heavy metals. So examining the samples is supposed to describe the subject that is examining the samples, that is carrying out that action. And of course, water is not examining samples, unless this is some sort of sci-fi movie. It's a scientist, right, or students, or researchers. The water is what constitutes the samples. So to correct this, we need to have the subject appear right after the introductory clause. So in examining the samples, the students found that the water was contaminated with heavy metals. And so we've actually also transformed this sentence from a passive sentence, the water was found to be, so the subject is not active, to an active sentence. The students are actors now, and they are actively finding that the water is contaminated. So it also improves your writing when you fix this grammatical mistake. So now we're going to move on to flow between sentences, and this is probably one of the most challenging things for a lot of writers. It can get tiring to think about how you're going to make sentences weave together when you have many, many, many sentences in a very long document. One way to think about doing this is the given new contract. And this is the principle that every sentence should refer back to either the sentence that comes before it or to the topic sentence of that paragraph, so that it's all sort of knitted together in a more complex matrix. We can use connecting words, transition words to do this, some of those conjunctive adverbs, or occasionally even some of our simple transition words like yet or and are okay to start sentences with, although not ideal for our formal academic writing. We can also do this by using indefinite pronouns that help us refer back to previously mentioned subjects and ideas, so that we're not using the same noun over and over again, this study, this study, this study, for example, we can use that or this or it if it's clear what we're referring to connect one sentence to the next. Or you can use this or that prior to the noun that you're discussing. So just to see this in action, here's a paragraph that does not use the given new contract. So the sentences here do not refer back to, clearly refer back to anyway, the sentence previous to it or to the topic sentence. So take a minute, pause the presentation, and think about how you might insert or change the beginning of each sentence so that it refers more explicitly to the topic sentence or to the sentence previous. So here's how I suggest correcting it. Of course, there are always multiple ways to do so, but Pakistan was one of many countries to sign on to the UN 17 Sustainable Development Goals in 2015. So instead of just launching into a quote, which can be a little abrupt, you're like, where is this quote coming from? Is it one of the goals? Is it someone talking about the goals? We say the sixth goal is to. So we know now that we are talking about one of these 17 goals, and now we're going to get an idea of what it's about. So moving essentially the end of that sentence to the beginning of that sentence bridges the gap a little bit more clearly. So instead of just saying freshwater access, just launching into talking about freshwater access, we're going to now connect it to the writer. So in my research area of freshwater access, the UN states that. So the beginning is perhaps referencing the quote previous. So we have a reference to water, and now we're bringing the UN back in, quoting, not verbatim, but referencing and paraphrasing something that they stated about fresh water. And then instead of a semicolon, we're going to use a transition word because the semicolons should be used judiciously, and in this case, I think a comma and a transition word are more effective. And then in the final sentence, instead of just offering another statistic paraphrased from this report, we're referring back to the SDG, which we introduced in the topic sentence, and number 6, specifically with another idea from that specific goal. So we're just weaving together this paragraph a little bit more tightly, making more references to help it flow for the writer. Another way to make sentences flow between each other is transition words and phrases. So we can use some of the conjunctive adverbs that I showed in one of the earlier slides. You can refer back to that. But there's also longer phrases that you might use to help connect one sentence to the next. And many of these especially will be used when comparing different ideas and concluding a paragraph. So meanwhile, you might use, if we're talking about what's happening in a different region, maybe we talked about one region, now we're moving to another. Meanwhile, over here, or different chronological periods. Furthermore, we're adding more information about our point. We're driving it home, essentially. Finally, this is obviously a phrase that indicates that we're wrapping up. For example, this is quite clear. We're preceding an example of what we just talked about. Similarly, same sort of thing as meanwhile, except we're talking about a parallel example. In contrast, maybe we're talking about what another study says or what's happening in a different area. Ultimately, another wrap-up word, or something where you might be kind of pulling out and giving a bird's eye view, in other words, sort of summary for your reader. In other words, same sort of thing, we're rephrasing, recasting what we just said, or maybe debriefing a quote. For that reason, so we're showing the cause in the previous sentence, and now we're going to show a potential solution or impact. Consequently, this is sort of the same thing as because or as a result. It's a nicer, perhaps, word than because. Indeed, this is a little bit of a throwaway word, but it's similar to furthermore. You're kind of driving home the point, or almost like an I told you so moment in your paper. In fact, you're going to add a statistic probably that's related to the previous sentence. In conclusion, these are both ways of wrapping up, so these can be maybe a concluding sentence in your paragraph. So transitions. This is another case where we have a paragraph without strong transitions, or perhaps even really good, give a new principle enacted. So take a minute, pause the presentation, and refer back to some of the previous slides in this presentation and try to add in transitions. So we have the same beginning, and then instead of just launching into talking about the melting of the ice sheets, which if you're knowledgeable about the subject, you know is related, we're going to use the word however, a transition word, and then this projection, so that's a given new, we're referring back to the projection offered in the previous sentence, doesn't account for the melting of the Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets. Scientists say these ice sheets. So again, we are referencing the ice sheets without having to repeat the phrase Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets. We're using these. Could melt if we increase the climate by 4 degrees Celsius. Consequently, the number of climate refugees could reach nearly 1 billion by 2050. So we're showing cause and effect between these two phenomena. So it's pretty simple. Again, if you know that you're someone who tends to write choppily or without transitions, really work this into your revision process, going through each sentence, making sure they are flowing from one to the next. This is a more simple form of making sentences flow, and also one that is riddled with grammatical errors, but we always want to make sure that we're using the correct pronouns. Otherwise, writing will definitely not flow because your reader will be confused about who or what you're talking about. So you want to make sure that you're using person pronouns for people and non-personal pronouns for non-people. That includes animals. So animals we typically do not assign human pronouns to. We refer to them as that, it, or which. You might take up issue with that, but that is technically how we're supposed to do it. We also want to make sure you get gender right in terms of pronouns, as well as singular and plural. Singular and plural is probably where we make most of our mistakes. So below is a sentence that has a couple of pronoun errors. Take a second, pause the presentation, see if you can catch them. So politicians are our subject here. We want to remember that. So when you're revising, if you're unsure if you got the right pronouns, make sure you have the right subject in mind the whole time. So many politicians aren't the people, they make themselves. So not himself, even though we might think, well, many of our politicians are male, unfortunately, or fortunately, however you perceive that. We might be gender skewing and then therefore using himself. So first of all, we need a plural pronoun, and we need one that is gender neutral, themselves. And then we want same thing, they have high rates of infidelity. We want the third person gender neutral pronoun there. And the public often discovers that their bank accounts are padded with handsome bribes. So pretty simple to correct, but you do want to make sure that you're getting these right. So make sure sentences flow and readable. So now we're going to move on to flow between paragraphs. This is sort of key to how you structure a paragraph. So it's not quite as simple as just adding a transition word, just slapping it on the beginning of a paragraph. It's a little bit more complex. So in general, you want to think about topic sentences, which are the first sentence of a paragraph, and concluding sentences, the last sentence of each paragraph, as the glue for your paper. So each paragraph is maybe a block, and you're gluing it together with other blocks to make a larger building. And just taking this analogy a little further, you want to therefore consider each paragraph as a mini essay. If you've heard the term flash fiction, this refers to fiction writing that is really short, not even just a short story, but even shorter, usually 500 words. So you want to think about each paragraph as a flash paper. Every paragraph should have one major idea, one driving idea. And that idea should be expressed in the topic sentence. And you can think of it as a mini thesis. So your theses, your papers have a larger hypothesis that you're working off of and trying to prove. And similarly, each paragraph should have a point or mini thesis, if you want to think about it that way, that you're getting across. And the topic sentence, in addition to expressing this thesis about the idea of the paragraph, should connect back to previous paragraphs. This is the given new contract in a larger scale. So you want the topic sentence to connect the reader with what they just read to the argument that you're about to make in the next paragraph. And then every paragraph should have a little conclusion as well, a mini conclusion that wraps up the point that you made. It doesn't mean you need to restate the mini thesis, but you should be referring back to it and showing that you have succeeded in proving the small idea that you wanted to get across in this paragraph. If you are more of a visual person, you can think of each paragraph as a sandwich, or hamburger is often used as a metaphor here. So you've got the bread on top. This is your topic sentence. You're introducing what will come next. So you want to pick a bread that's going to correspond with the fillings in your sandwich. And then if you are wanting to think about this pretty formulaically, if that helps with your writing, you have 3 supporting sentences, let's say. So you have one sentence that's going to help prove that topic sentence, another, and a third. So maybe they're exploring the idea in 3 different places or 3 different times. Maybe there are 3 different examples, 3 different paraphrases from studies, whatever helps you to think about that. And of course, it doesn't have to really be 3 supporting sentences. It could be more complex than that, more sentences, fewer sentences, just one idea that you're exploring at greater length. And then you have your concluding sentence, the bread on the outside, that wraps things up nicely. And we can also use the given new contract on the paragraph level. So these are taken out of context, but these are examples of how you might refer back to the previous paragraph in a topic sentence. So the first, in spite of the many challenges I face, I have also identified a plethora of opportunities for my business. So in spite of the many challenges I face, we're going to take a guess here that the paragraph previous talked about challenges. And now you're signaling to the reader, okay, yes, there are many challenges, but I also have opportunities. And so the assumption is that this paragraph will begin talking about some of these opportunities, or at least one of them. The next one. However, many leaders in the field of freshwater monitoring argue that drones are the most efficient technology available. So perhaps, this is less clear-cut, but perhaps in the previous paragraph, we talk about another technology that is being used in freshwater monitoring. And now we're cueing the reader that we're going to talk about drones as what is being pitched by some as one of the most effective technologies on the market. Finally, while waste oil has many possible uses, converting it into biodiesel is the most cost-effective solution. So, perhaps in the previous paragraph, we talked more generally about waste oil, where it comes from, and maybe we talked about just one of its other uses, or several different uses. Maybe we talked about how waste oil is converted into soap, for example, or recycled to be used again in perhaps what is a more undesirable cooking practice. But now we're signaling that we're going to start talking about biodiesel and why it's so cost effective. Finally, we're going to talk for a couple of minutes about how to make sections or chapters flow. And this is less important, to be honest. Obviously, if we have different chapters, you don't really need to refer back to the introduction and the literature review, although you should certainly be cognizant of what you've discussed and not be redundant. So you don't want to repeat sentences or the same information over and over again. If you know that you introduced a certain concept in the previous chapter, then you can shorthand it, make reference to it, but you don't need to spell it all out again and have the citation and everything necessarily. You can refer to it more briefly, for example. But one way to make sections flow well is to use sections within sections, so sections within chapters. And setting them apart with headers that are very descriptive can be very helpful for breaking up longer, complex sentences and helping the reader really understand what you're going to be discussing and really staying on point. And when you're using headers like this, transitions are often unnecessary because the reader knows what you just discussed, and now you're telling them explicitly with the title what you're going to discuss next. However, if you do feel that transitions between your sections are in order, here are a couple of examples of how you might do this. So, despite the growing popularity of desalination, reservoir engineering remains a more affordable technology for Pakistan. So the assumption here is that in the previous section, you talked about desalination, and now you're going to be talking about reservoirs, about dams, for example. Another example, in the previous section, I provided an overview of ag water consumption in the Sindh province today. Now I will discuss projections about the future of agriculture in this region under different future precipitation scenarios. So the way this is set up, we know exactly what was discussed in the previous section because the writer is telling us exactly what was discussed, and we know what will be discussed in the section to come. And this is not sloppy at all. Being really explicit with what you're going to do as the writer and researcher behind the paper is really helpful for a reader, especially when you're talking about complex subjects and you have a paper that's 40, 50, 60 pages long. This can really help guide the reader through your ideas, through your logic and argumentation. So it's fine to refer to sections of the paper explicitly and what you will be discussing next. You can even do this on the paragraph level. Although you wouldn't say in the paragraph prior, you would just say previously I provided an overview. And it's also okay to use the first person. You could also convert these into third person with more of a passive voice approach if you are trying to avoid first person. So these are just examples of how you can help guide the reader through each section of your paper. That's it for writing smoothly. Make sure that you pay attention to this in the revision process. This is the best place to catch choppy writing and notice, maybe by reading out loud that your sentences or paragraphs are not flowing properly, and it's easy to go back and restructure, re-engineer your papers to make them more smooth and readable.